They made her move to the back because of her skin. No explanation. No warning. Just a quiet reroute through a service door and a smile that meant nothing. She paid for a first-class seat like everyone else, but the moment she stepped up to board, something in their system, some silent unwritten rule, decided she didn't belong. They skipped her towel, ignored her drink, froze her row, whispered codes into radios as if she were a threat, not a mother traveling with her daughter. And when red wine soaked her suit from a drunk passenger, they didn't say sorry. They asked her to move. She never raised her voice, never caused a scene. But by the time the plane landed, the people who tried to humiliate her had no idea the storm they'd invited on board. Who was she? And why did the world erupt when the truth came out? If you're watching this, you're not too late to witness the unraveling. This isn't just a story about race, power, and silence. It's about what happens when the wrong person gets underestimated at 35,000 feet. What would you have done if it were you in that seat? Let us know in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. If stories like this matter to you, hit like, hit subscribe, and stay locked in. You don't want to miss what's coming next. She wasn't flashy, but she stood out, an elegant calm in a world that never stopped moving. As she approached the first-class queue, a middle-aged gate agent with a laminated name tag and too much aftershave glanced up. His eyes flicked quickly across her attire, her skin, her confidence. Then did what she had seen 100 times before, registered all three as contradiction. "Good morning, ma'am," he said with a forced brightness. "First class." "Yes." "Seat 2A. She handed him her boarding pass and ID, her voice even. He scanned the documents, lips tightening in thought, as if a red flag had silently triggered in his mind. After a few seconds too long, he looked up. "MS. Mitchell, we actually have an enhanced boarding process for select passengers today. Would you mind following me?" She arched a brow. "Enhanced?" "Just a quick shortcut," he replied, already stepping out from behind the podium. "Much faster. No wait lines. Direct access to the aircraft via service path." Raven said nothing. She simply nodded once and followed. He guided her away from the carpeted first-class entry, down a quieter side hallway lined with gray walls and utility signage. It was clean but functional, not polished, not designed for prestige. They reached a metal door labeled "Authorized Personnel Only." He swiped a card, opened it, and gestured her through. "This is used for private or expedited boardings," he said. "Helps ease congestion." Raven stepped inside and immediately noticed the difference. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach and old air. The lighting was cold and industrial. It felt more like a backstage entrance than a VIP route. At the end was a stair lift platform leading directly to the back of the aircraft. No red carpet, no champagne, no branded signage, just bare aluminum and utility rails. "Take these steps here," the agent said. "Once you're inside, flight staff will get you settled. Enjoy your flight." His smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. Raven climbed the stairs silently. When she stepped into the aircraft, through the rear galley instead of the forward jet bridge entrance, she was greeted not with a welcome, but with a narrowed glance from a flight attendant prepping drink carts. The woman's uniform was tight, her bun tighter. She didn't speak. She just looked at Raven, then reached subtly for her radio. With her back turned to the cabin, she pressed the button and whispered into the receiver. "Ma 9 just boarded. Hipiat Ma Novi. Guest flagged as potential disturbance. Keep eyes front." Raven heard it, clear enough. Her face didn't change. She had heard versions of it before. On corporate campuses, at security checks, in five-star hotel lobbies. She walked forward without pausing, her ticket still in hand. As she entered the forward cabin, the temperature changed, not just in degrees, but in attitude. First class was lit with soft golden ambience. Glass partitions gleamed. Leather seats stretched out like thrones. A younger attendant was passing around warm eucalyptus-scented towels, each rolled into porcelain trays with tongs and offered delicately to seated passengers. Raven watched him serve row 1A, then 1B, then pivot to the other aisle. The tray never reached her. She reached her seat, 2A. It was clean, but lacked the crispness she'd expected. No towel, no drink menu, no amenities kit. She placed her carry-on above, took her seat quietly, and waited. She glanced left. The man in 2B had already received his towel and was sipping a glass of citrus water. The couple in row 3 were laughing as the attendant handed them hot towels laced with lemongrass. Still, no one approached her. No eye contact. No welcome. She wasn't invisible, just willfully overlooked. Raven folded her hands, looked straight ahead, and said nothing. Just beyond her peripheral vision, the attendant with the tight bun reappeared briefly in the aisle, whispering something into another crew member's ear, then vanishing behind the service curtain without so much as a glance in Raven's direction. The gesture wasn't overt, but Raven saw the ripple it caused. How the younger male attendant who had previously skipped her now avoided her entire row altogether, even as he gracefully presented plush towels to the pair seated behind her. The woman in 3B giggled at something he said while unfolding her lavender-scented cloth and pressing it to her face, like it was a ritual of belonging. Raven's seat remained untouched. No towel, no offer, not even eye contact. The man seated across the aisle, mid-50s with a silver Rolex and the tan of inherited wealth, looked over at Raven for a fraction of a second, then returned to reading the Wall Street Journal with the practiced indifference of someone who had been taught not to look too long at things that didn't fit the image. In contrast, the teenage girl in 1A, no more than 16, twisted in her seat to examine Raven openly, eyes curious and confused. Her mother gently nudged her shoulder and leaned in with a hushed explanation that Raven couldn't hear but knew by heart. Probably something about how sometimes people book upgrades, or how not everyone in first class is regular clientele. The girl nodded, turned back around, and discreetly sniffed her towel as if ensuring her world hadn't been disturbed. Raven exhaled slowly, letting the breath linger in her chest before releasing it. Her eyes drifting across the seat in front of her, where a slim crack near the tray hinge had been carefully ignored by maintenance. It wasn't the flaw that bothered her. It was that she alone seemed given the version of service where flaws were acceptable. The male attendant finally returned, moving swiftly down the left side of the aisle with a silver tray of drinks balanced expertly in one hand. He paused beside Raven's seat without making eye contact, then shifted his tray to serve the gentleman in 2B. A lean, middle-aged man with crisp trousers and an exaggerated baritone who asked for sparkling water with lime. The attendant nodded, handed him a drink, then turned and moved on. Raven blinked. Nothing. Not even the standard, "May I get you something?" She opened her mouth slightly, but before she could speak, the intercom above crackled to life with the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for final cabin check. Please ensure all carry-ons are properly stored, seatbacks upright, and tray tables secured." The moment passed. The crew began to move with greater purpose. One by one, passengers around her were checked and greeted. Some received blankets. One man in 1C was handed a second glass of wine with a wink and a quiet, "Welcome back, Mr. Templeton." Another woman was complimented on her handbag. Raven, meanwhile, sat frozen in a bubble of intentional omission. A few rows behind her, she heard a whisper. She didn't get one. Another voice, this time male, amused, replied, "Probably doesn't need one. Some folks sweat less under pressure." A shallow laugh followed, clipped and awkward, like it wasn't sure if it had permission to be mean. Raven didn't turn around. She didn't flinch. But inside, the insult settled like a stone. It wasn't the words, they were dull, uninspired. It was the way the entire cabin conspired in silence. No one corrected the attendant. No one asked why one guest had been skipped. No one seemed curious why a paying first-class passenger hadn't been offered even a napkin, let alone basic human courtesy. Across the aisle, the man in 2B shifted suddenly. His foot tapped. He glanced once at Raven, then leaned toward the aisle as if contemplating saying something, only to lean back again and sigh. Whether out of discomfort or indifference, she couldn't tell. The flight attendant with the bun emerged again, this time whispering something into the ear of the junior attendant. The phrase manifest verification was all Raven could catch before the junior nodded. glanced once at her seat, then walked briskly back to the front of the cabin. That same attendant reappeared moments later with a tablet in hand, making a visible show of checking rows 1A through 3B. Everyone, that is, except 2A. He skipped over her, as though her presence were inconvenient to the story being written around her. Raven stared straight ahead, hands folded neatly in her lap. Outside the oval window, the tarmac shimmered under the afternoon sun. The man in 1C chuckled as the attendant poured his Pinot Noir, while the woman in 3A took a picture of her plate, plated like something from a five-star bistro, all garnished greens and sauce swirls. Raven, still seated quietly in 2A, waited. Her tray remained folded, untouched. Her stomach rumbled slightly, muted by the hum of the engines and the rustle of linen napkins being unfolded around her. She had pre-selected her entree 2 days prior, part of the airline's premium Skylux Personal Touch program, where first-class passengers could customize meals to dietary preference. She had chosen the sesame-glazed sea bass with jasmine rice and heirloom vegetables, a meal she had once enjoyed on another international flight without incident. Yet now, as the junior flight attendant approached her row carrying a cart of plated meals, he paused, flipped over a small checklist, and frowned. His eyes barely met hers as he said, "Apologies, Ms. Mitchell, but your selected entree appears to be unavailable. We've substituted an alternate option." He placed a plastic-sealed meal in front of her, lukewarm chicken breast over limp broccoli in a disposable container, the kind reserved for crew or standby passengers. It clashed violently with the ceramic dinnerware on every tray around her. Raven looked at the tray, then at the attendant, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't the sea bass I ordered." He nodded without apology. "We had an unexpected shortage. This was what was available. It's just as nutritious, might even be more suited to your taste profile." "My taste profile?" she repeated. "Yes," he said, pulling back slightly. "Simpler seasoning. Less aggressive spice." She stared at him for a long beat, but said nothing. The man in 2B, mid-bite, shifted in his seat and glanced sideways at her meal. He looked as though he wanted to say something, but then decided against it and continued eating in silence. The attendant rolled the cart away before she could respond. Raven didn't touch the food. Instead, she unfolded the starched napkin in her lap with mechanical grace, draped it across her knees, and picked up the unopened bottle of water beside her tray. The label had already been peeled halfway off. It wasn't chilled. Minutes later, the lead attendant appeared again, Lisa, the one with the tightly pinned bun, and leaned in to whisper something to the junior flight attendant by the galley wall. He nodded, shot a quick glance toward Raven's seat, then turned to another attendant passing through and tapped her lightly on the shoulder. That attendant gave a faint frown and stepped aside, disappearing behind the curtain. A pattern began to emerge. From that point on, no single crew member returned to Raven's seat more than once. They rotated, passed duties along, always just out of reach, always with a sideways glance or silent handoff. It was choreographed avoidance, rehearsed like protocol. Raven recognized it. She'd seen it used in corporate culture, where departments ostracized difficult clients through silence, through selective unavailability. It was effective. It sent a message. They didn't want her here. One attendant left a drink list on her armrest and never returned for the order. Another dropped a single napkin beside her, without cutlery. The man across the aisle was on his second glass of wine. The woman 2 rows down had received a personalized dessert with her name piped in chocolate. Raven still hadn't received a greeting. Then came the final insult, a slip of paper. It fluttered from the galley cart as the junior attendant passed her row again. It landed near her foot. She reached down, retrieved it, and read it silently. In rushed handwriting, clearly meant for internal eyes only, were the words, "Seat 2A, avoid if possible. Difficult demeanor. History of complaints. Don't engage unless necessary." The words hit harder than the cold meal. Raven folded the note once, twice, tucked it under her tray. Her face remained composed. Her hands were steady, but her thoughts churned. This wasn't incompetence. This was policy, internal, unspoken, but real. They had labeled her, passed judgment, and distributed the verdict without trial. Not a single person had asked her a question. No one had voiced concern. The label had traveled faster than her boarding pass. She wasn't being ignored because they were busy. She was being punished for existing where they didn't want her to exist. The air in first class, once chilled and fragrant, now felt thick and stale. The passengers nearby began to settle into reclined positions, pressing buttons for massage functions, snuggling into blankets. The woman in 3A called an attendant by name, and received a fresh cappuccino with a heart swirled in the foam. Raven folded her arms slowly and leaned back. She adjusted the blanket that had finally been left at her seat without a word, but it did little to help. The cabin's temperature in her section was out of balance, markedly colder than any normal flight she had ever experienced. The other passengers remained untouched by the shift. A woman 2 rows down removed her blazer. Another man loosened his collar and laughed easily over a glass of brandy. Only Raven reached for warmth. Only Raven shifted in her seat and pulled her arms in close. Eventually, she pressed the call button, not out of complaint, but necessity. When the male attendant appeared, he approached with an air of suppressed annoyance, stopping a step farther from her than etiquette required. "Yes, ma'am." She gestured subtly. "Is the air system malfunctioning? It's unusually cold right here." He blinked once, then offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, the system is functioning as expected. First-class cabins are calibrated to international temperature standards. Perhaps you're just not used to it." His tone was pleasant, his words sharpened to cut. Raven didn't answer. She simply nodded once, understanding exactly what he meant and what he wanted her to feel. Less than 10 minutes later, as she tried to get comfortable despite the chill now creeping through her blouse and sleeves, another uniformed figure approached. This one was new, unfamiliar, with a hard-set jaw and clipboard in hand. He didn't introduce himself. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "we're performing a spot compliance check for safety. I need you to unbuckle your belt, stand, and identify all items stored under your seat." Raven raised a brow, calm but alert. "This has already been verified during boarding." "This is secondary protocol," he replied, not even attempting a smile. "We've detected an unusual weight imbalance in the cabin. Regulation requires that we verify personal compliance in affected rows." "Affected rows?" she asked. "Which rows?" He hesitated for a moment too long before answering. "Just yours for now." Raven stared at him for a beat, then calmly reached down and unbuckled her belt. She stood. He observed her without comment. She reached under her seat, retrieved her carry-on, and opened it neatly, displaying the contents: documents, headphones, a travel blanket, 2 books. Nothing excessive. Nothing unusual. He nodded, scribbled something on the clipboard, then said, "Can you step into the aisle for just a moment?" "Why?" "To allow a full sweep of your area. Standard protocol." Raven glanced around. Other passengers were watching now, some openly, others discreetly. No one else was being asked to do the same. She stepped aside, without a word. The man crouched to inspect beneath her seat with a small flashlight, then opened the overhead compartment above her row, despite it being closed and tagged. He jotted another note, nodded again, and stood. "You may be seated," he said, then walked off without explanation. As Raven sat back down and clicked her belt into place, the silence around her felt heavier than before. A whisper to her left, "Did you see that?" A hushed reply. She must have triggered something. Raven's hands rested lightly on her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't ask for further clarification. She simply looked out the window again, the clouds outside a rolling sea of white, deceptively peaceful. The man in 2B shifted uncomfortably, as if suddenly aware of how loudly the imbalance had become. When he reached to adjust his air vent, his eyes flicked toward her, but quickly dropped. The humiliation hadn't come in the form of a shout or a scene or a confrontation. It had arrived through procedure, through quiet microactions, through weaponized professionalism. She hadn't been accused. She hadn't been called out. but she had been labeled, marked, and exposed for all to see. A child giggled somewhere in the front row, and soon there was movement, one of the attendants gesturing for two children, both blonde and bright-eyed, to follow her toward the cockpit. Their parents beamed proudly as the children skipped past Raven's row. "Captain's giving a tour today," the mother said to no one in particular, her voice floating in the air like privilege always did, loud even when whispered. Raven's daughter, Ava, who had been quietly playing with a puzzle app on a tablet beside her, looked up with wide eyes. "Mommy," she whispered, barely audible, "do you think we could go too?" Raven hesitated only a second, then nodded gently. "You can ask," she said, smoothing the collar of Ava's dress shirt, straightening her posture. Ava stood, small hands gripping the seat in front of her for balance, and began to make her way toward the attendant who was returning with the other children, now giddy with excitement. Before Ava could speak, the attendant placed a firm hand on the girl's shoulder, leaned down, and whispered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Sweetheart, maybe next time. The cockpit is really complicated. You probably wouldn't understand. Have you ever even flown in one of these before?" Ava blinked, unsure how to respond. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Raven watched the moment unfold without moving, but her fingers curled slightly, gripping the edge of her seat. The attendant gently turned Ava around by the shoulders and guided her back toward Raven's row. "Your seat is back there." "Okay," she added with a tone that might have sounded kind, if it hadn't dripped with quiet dismissal. Ava climbed back into the seat beside her mother without a word, looking smaller than before, her curiosity crushed. "What did she say?" Raven asked softly. "She said I wouldn't get it," Ava replied, voice flat. "She said I never flew one of these before." Raven reached over, brushed a curl from Ava's cheek, and kissed the top of her head. She said nothing else. Not yet. Later. Minutes later, as if the cabin itself sensed her restraint and decided to test its limits, a man 2 rows up, clearly drunk, shirt unbuttoned slightly and tie loose, rose unsteadily with a glass of red wine in hand. He stumbled as the aircraft dipped gently in turbulence, and in the motion, his glass tilted. The entire contents spilled across the aisle, splashing directly across Raven's cream-colored pants and Ava's tablet. The man cursed as he regained balance, looked down at the mess, and then looked at Raven with bleary eyes and a cocked eyebrow. "You should have stayed in your lane, sweetheart," he slurred. "Don't block the aisle if you don't know how to sit properly." A few passengers looked over, but no one spoke. One woman narrowed her eyes in confusion, but quickly turned away. Raven looked down at her soaked trousers, the scarlet stain bleeding into the fabric, and slowly lifted her gaze. Her face remained composed. She reached for a napkin, not one provided, but one she had kept in her own bag, and blotted the liquid silently from her knees. The attendant closest to the incident, Lisa, appeared a moment too late, her eyes darting between the drunk man and Raven. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, already half-turning as if the answer wouldn't matter. The man scoffed and handed her the empty glass. "Spilled a bit, that's all." She was in the way. "I see," Lisa said, lips pursed. "Please take your seat, sir." She turned to Raven, but didn't offer a towel or apology. "We can have that cleaned in Zurich," she added. "Just fill out a damage form upon landing." Then she was gone. Ava reached out and clutched Raven's hand. The child's small fingers trembled. Raven gripped back, firm and sure, her mind no longer documenting, but calculating. There was no justice here, not from them. Not now. The cabin had confirmed its rules, carved in silence, enforced through procedure. She had been marked since the moment she entered. Yet somewhere in that uneasy stillness, a spark was lit, not by Raven, but by someone watching. Kayla Dorsey, the youngest flight attendant on the crew, had been observing since boarding. She had seen the missing towel, the cold meal, the deliberate reassignment. She had watched as Raven and her daughter were excluded, ignored, and now humiliated. Kayla had been trained to smile through discomfort, to follow orders, to blend into the expectations of premium service. But what she had just witnessed crossed a line she could no longer ignore. She stepped forward, hesitating for only a breath before approaching Raven's row. Her voice was soft but firm. "Ma'am, let me get that cleaned properly. she said, already producing a fresh towel and a bottle of club soda. She knelt down and gently patted at the stain on Ava's tablet first, then Raven's trousers. This shouldn't have happened, she added, glancing toward the galley where the other attendants stood pretending not to watch. Raven gave a quiet nod of gratitude, but said nothing. Ava looked up and whispered, "Thank you." And for the first time since takeoff, someone on board looked at her like she mattered. Kayla rose to her feet and turned toward the back, heading directly for the galley. There, behind the curtain, Lisa was already waiting, arms crossed, jaw set tight. "What do you think you're doing?" Lisa hissed. "The manifest tag said no contact. That woman is flagged." "Flagged for what?" Kayla countered, her voice still hushed but trembling with restrained conviction. "For expecting to be treated like every other paying passenger? That girl's a child, Lisa." "This isn't your decision to make," Lisa snapped, stepping in closer. "You're on probationary status. You were told to observe, not interfere. You want to finish this program? Learn to follow orders." Kayla stiffened. Her training, her evaluations, her final placement, all balanced on the edge of that conversation. But some moments outweighed policy. "I'm not going to pretend that what we're doing is professional," she said. "You want to call it procedure? Fine. But it's prejudice." Lisa's eyes narrowed. "Then submit your resignation when we land." The words were quiet, deadly, and absolute. Kayla didn't respond. She turned back toward the cabin, pulled the curtain aside, and resumed her duties with a face that betrayed nothing but control. Raven saw her return, saw the way her shoulders were square, but her steps slightly slower, the way her lips pressed into a hard line. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them. Not pity, not sorrow, but recognition. 30 minutes later, as the plane cruised somewhere over the North Atlantic, Raven's in-flight messaging app buzzed to life. It wasn't a notification from a contact, but a system alert. Message from Skylux Legal Affairs. She tapped the screen. A preloaded PDF opened. A formal cease and desist warning from the airline's legal department, citing her disruptive behavior, the unfounded escalation of normal service processes, and verbal intimidation directed at flight crew. The letter concluded with a statement that Skylux reserved the right to pursue legal action for any further public or reputational damage. Raven read it once, then again. The audacity made her stomach churn, not with fear, but with something colder. This wasn't just silencing. It was a warning shot, a preemptive strike. They were trying to rewrite the narrative before it left the cabin. She closed the file, sat straighter, and smiled, not because anything was funny, but because the desperation behind the threat told her something vital. They knew who she was. They just didn't know they knew yet. Meanwhile, Kayla continued moving through the cabin with robotic efficiency, her eyes no longer scanning faces, but fixed ahead, like someone already walking toward the consequences. Every action she took now was cataloged by Lisa, who scribbled on a notepad between trips to the galley, her satisfaction thinly veiled. As the sun dipped lower outside the cabin window, casting long shadows across Raven's seat, a quiet resolve settled over her. They had taken her towel, her meal, her voice, and even tried to take her dignity. But in doing so, they had left something behind, a paper trail. The screen came alive with a video, a clip, time-stamped just 40 minutes earlier, already accumulating thousands of views per minute. A passenger from row 3C had filmed the aftermath of the spilled wine incident, capturing Raven's poised restraint, Ava's trembling silence, and Kayla's brief moment of human defiance. The footage didn't show the wine as it fell, but it captured the smirk on the drunken man's face, the indifference of the crew, and most damning of all, the cold, practiced tone of Lisa as she dismissed the event as standard turbulence. The clip had gone viral, picked up by an independent journalist who recognized Raven's face. And just like that, the silence shattered. In real time, as the plane still cut across the sky, news feeds lit up with the story. Black woman humiliated in first class. Turns out she's the lead scientist behind a billion-dollar medical breakthrough. They called her a disturbance. She's the reason their airline even exists. Raven closed the app and exhaled slowly, as if releasing 2 hours of venom in a single breath. She didn't need to say a word. The world had begun speaking for her. Passengers near the front began murmuring louder now, phones pinging with alerts, eyes darting toward her row, with a growing mix of realization and unease. Even a man in 2B, who had kept his distance all flight, now sat upright, visibly rereading something on his screen before glancing sidelong at her. For the first time, he looked nervous. Lisa re-emerged from the galley just as the wave began to hit. A passenger across the aisle leaned into her path and showed her a phone. "Is this her?" he asked quietly. "Is this the woman in 2A?" Lisa's mask of professionalism began to crack as she took one look at the screen and froze. The image was unmistakable. Raven Mitchell standing beside the CEO of Geniris Biopharma, flanked by medical officials, and holding a vial of the world's first adaptive RNA vaccine. Under the headline, in bold white letters, read the words, "Mitchell, scientist, humanitarian, visionary, target." Lisa's voice dropped to a whisper. "Excuse me." She turned and disappeared behind the curtain again, this time not with command, but with panic. Meanwhile, in a locked folder on Raven's tablet, a document had already been drafted, not by her, but by her legal and logistics team. It had sat there since the previous week, awaiting only her authorization. It was titled, "Immediate Withdrawal of Transport Partnership Skylux Logistics Division." She tapped the screen. A prompt appeared. "Are you sure you want to execute this action?" Raven didn't hesitate. She pressed confirm. Somewhere, 30,000 feet below, a server acknowledged the request. Within seconds, 3 international distribution hubs were notified that Geniris Biopharma's transport contracts, valued at over $1.5 million annually, were officially voided, effective immediately. The airline that had quietly labeled her as an inconvenience had just lost access to its most prestigious logistics partnership, one that had boosted its stock valuation by 12% the previous quarter. A private email, addressed directly to the Skylux executive board, began deploying from her office server. The subject line was brief: "You just lost more than a seat." Around her, whispers grew into murmurs, and murmurs into stunned silence. Kayla, returning from the rear galley with a resigned expression, caught sight of Raven, saw the subtle shift in energy around the row, and paused. Their eyes met again. Kayla didn't smile. She didn't need to. Raven simply gave her a faint nod, silent recognition that justice had already begun unfolding. The man across from her leaned forward slightly, cleared his throat, and said, "Dr. Mitchell, I didn't," but she cut him off without looking. "You did." Her voice was soft, but final. A beat passed. Then 2. And somewhere in the quiet discomfort of privilege being dismantled in real time, the cabin changed. Devices buzzed softly as more headlines filled the feed, each one confirming that the woman in 2A wasn't just someone important, but someone powerful. Raven Mitchell had become the center of a public reckoning they could no longer ignore, and outside the aircraft, the storm she'd held back for hours had begun to thunder. A breaking report hit major news outlets within minutes of eclipse virality. Skylux Airlines accused of racial profiling in first class, not the first time. It wasn't clickbait. It was an investigation months in the making, written by a journalist named Eric Devlin, an independent reporter specializing in corporate discrimination. He had been tracking flight manifest irregularities from Skylux for nearly a year, cross-referencing boarding data with internal logs leaked by a disgruntled former employee. What he found painted a chilling pattern. Passengers of color in first class were repeatedly reassigned, rerouted, or downgraded under vague justifications: system lag, weight balance, safety compliance, many of them matching the exact phrasing Raven had experienced. Some had filed complaints. Most had given up. But none of them had the public weight of Raven Mitchell. Devlin's report went live mid-flight. By the time Skylux's comms team caught it, the damage was already rippling through aviation forums, travel blogs, and financial channels. The hashtag #C3A trended globally within 20 minutes, followed closely by hashtag #RidingWhileBlack and hashtag Skylies. Investors took notice. One in particular, Vantage Dominion, a global private equity firm holding nearly 7% of Skylux's parent company, issued a terse statement that afternoon. effective immediately. Vantage Dominion has divested its shares in response to verified allegations of systemic discrimination, including a confirmed violation involving our advisory board member, Dr. Raven Mitchell. The statement spread like fire. Within an hour, 2 more firms followed. By the second hour, Skylux stock dipped 14%, halting automated trading twice in a single session. But the most stunning consequence came not from numbers, but from names. The chairwoman of Vantage Dominion herself, a woman rarely quoted publicly, released a personal message to media outlets, confirming what no one had known. Raven Mitchell had served on Vantage Dominion's Medical Ethics Advisory Board for 3 years, consulting on pharmaceutical funding standards, public health policy, and crisis management. Dr. Mitchell has been instrumental to our most humanitarian ventures, the statement read. Her judgment, character, and brilliance are above reproach. We are appalled that one of our key partners failed to recognize the person they chose to humiliate. Back on the plane, Raven watched the cascade unfold in silence, the same way she had endured the early hours of this flight. No gloating, no performance, just observation. Every slight that had been delivered under the mask of policy was now being weighed on a global scale, and the balance was shifting violently. Across the aisle, a businessman who had earlier nodded in complicit silence now began tapping an apology email draft to an executive assistant, clearly distancing himself from the unfolding scandal. The woman in 3B, who had once laughed over lavender towels, now stared ahead blankly, her folded arms no longer a posture of comfort, but of fear. Lisa had not been seen for over 20 minutes. The galley door remained closed, and the junior attendants whispered in worried tones, eyes darting back and forth like mice caught in a floodlight. Kayla moved with quiet precision, now the only flight crew member openly addressing passengers. She checked belts, adjusted lights, and brought Raven a fresh drink, this time without hesitation. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" she asked softly. Raven looked at her, saw the defiance still burning quietly behind her eyes, and replied, "No. But thank you for remembering your uniform doesn't define your character." Kayla gave a small, grim smile and moved on. Ava stirred beside her, looking up from her tablet. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. Raven didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, where the clouds had broken just enough to see the sun glinting off the ocean below, like 1,000 truths rising all at once. Then she turned to her daughter. "We already are." Behind them, another passenger pulled up the news and muttered, "She works for the people who own half this industry." Raven sat still, dignified as always, while Ava leaned quietly against her shoulder, unaware that their arrival would be far more significant than any ordinary landing. The moment the wheels touched the tarmac, phones buzzed back to life with renewed fury, pushing out headlines with the velocity of an unstoppable tide. Breaking: Skylux Airline's CEO terminated amid viral discrimination scandal. Confirmed: entire Skylux flight crew subpoenaed in federal class action civil rights suit. The push alerts came in waves, and with each one, the hush over the cabin deepened. Passengers clutched devices like lifelines, reading, scrolling, trying to make sense of how a single mistreated passenger had turned their flight into a corporate implosion. But the real unraveling was just beginning. Less than an hour after touchdown, the board of Skylux released an emergency statement confirming the immediate removal of CEO Alan Hartley, citing gross mishandling of internal policy and a pattern of negligence that has violated the core values of the Skylux brand. His photo, once featured across global business journals as the face of aviation innovation, now accompanied every story detailing his fall from grace. Footage leaked of his emergency video call with the board, where he was visibly sweating, grasping at excuses, blaming miscommunication, rogue crew members, and cultural misunderstanding. But the board, facing mounting shareholder pressure and the exodus of strategic partnerships, voted unanimously. Hartley was out, and he wasn't going quietly. Legal teams quickly confirmed that he, along with 5 other senior executives, including the VP of in-flight operations, the Director of Customer Ethics, and the Head of Brand Risk, had all received federal subpoenas connected to discriminatory practices spanning at least 3 fiscal years. Their internal messages, scheduling logs, and service memos were now official evidence in a federal civil rights inquiry. Lisa, the flight attendant who had led the mistreatment of Raven, was suspended pending investigation. The airline's internal Slack messages had been leaked anonymously, including a thread where she referred to Raven as entitled baggage in business couture. That screenshot alone had become the center of online outrage, shared and reshared by millions. Meanwhile, 3 of Skylux's most lucrative transport contracts, with major medical networks in Chicago, San Diego, and Boston, were formally canceled within 12 hours of Raven's name being associated with the incident. These hospitals, longtime logistics clients for emergency organ transport and critical pharmaceutical shipments, publicly cited a breach of ethical trust and concern for patient dignity as cause for contract termination. The revenue loss exceeded $48 million, confirmed in a late-evening SEC filing that sent Skylux stock plummeting for the second day in a row. Trade analysts called it a textbook reputational collapse, while social justice advocates called it the first time accountability landed faster than the plane. In airports across the country, protesters began organizing. At LAX, a group of nurses staged a sit-in near Skylux's counter, holding signs that read, "We won't let patients fly with prejudice." At JFK, students lined terminals wearing shirts that bore Raven's silhouette and the words, "Her seat was earned. Your silence wasn't." Back on the ground. As Raven and Ava exited the aircraft, surrounded by awkward silence and sidelong glances, they were greeted not by security or chaos, but by a composed woman in a gray pantsuit holding a digital tablet and an earpiece. "Dr. Mitchell," she said calmly, "we're here to escort you privately. Transportation has been arranged. Your legal and PR teams are on standby, but there's no press at this terminal. We've ensured that." Raven nodded, thanked her, and guided Ava forward. The hallway was quiet, sterile, but it pulsed with tension. On the other side of the glass, photographers and activists crowded the main terminal, kept back by barriers, but energized by what her presence now represented. A symbol, a shift, an example. In the privacy of the black sedan waiting curbside, Raven slid into the leather seat beside Ava and finally allowed her shoulders to lower. Not in exhaustion, but in conclusion. They had tried to take everything from her with quiet cruelty, disguised as policy. But in doing so, they had exposed the very rut they built their empire on. And now, one by one, it was falling. Months passed, but the fallout from that one flight never faded. Headlines moved on, as they always did, chasing the next scandal, the next upheaval, the next outrage. But within the halls of Skylux, and across every executive boardroom that had once viewed customer experience as a numbers game rather than a moral contract, the memory of Raven Mitchell remained not as a controversy, but as a lesson carved into corporate history. In the weeks following the collapse, committees were formed, PR firms were fired, and consultants were hired to perform post-crisis triage. Yet none of their efforts slowed the bleeding until something entirely unexpected happened. It began with a letter, handwritten, slipped into the mailbox of Raven's Research Foundation, addressed only to Dr. Mitchell. No company logo, no formal header, just an envelope sealed in humility. Inside was a folded page of unsteady ink, written by a man who had once worn the title Regional Flight Operations Manager with pride, but who now introduced himself simply as James, the one who stood behind Lisa that day, and said nothing. He admitted to following every internal directive without question, brushing aside the discomfort he felt as policy demanded silence in the face of disrespect. He confessed to helping authorize the passenger reassignment protocol that had targeted Raven. He ended the letter with a sentence that struck deeper than any legal ruling. "My daughter, Tessa, is alive today because of your research. I knew your name, I just didn't recognize your face. I see now. I'm sorry." Raven didn't reply. She didn't need to. Days later, that same man showed up at the Foundation's annual ethics symposium, not as a speaker or a guest, but as a volunteer working the check-in table, distributing name badges, answering questions with quiet reverence. It was there, during a break between panels, that Raven saw him from across the lobby. He didn't approach her. He didn't need to. She walked over, paused beside him, and said, "You gave me silence when I needed a voice. But today, you chose to show up. That matters." He choked out a thank you, tears threatening at the edge of his composure, and in that moment, something shifted, not in power, but in understanding. Over the next year, Skylux was dismantled and rebuilt under public scrutiny. A new leadership team, diverse in both background and philosophy, took the helm. They didn't just adopt change, they institutionalized it. From mandatory anti-bias training at every level to revised boarding protocols with third-party audits, nothing remained untouched. But the most symbolic transformation came when the board extended an offer that stunned the industry. Raven Mitchell, the woman they once tried to erase from a seat she rightfully held, was named Honorary Advisor on Human Dignity and Service Ethics. It was a title she accepted not for prestige, but for purpose. She rewrote their code of conduct, reframed how dignity was measured in customer service, and introduced new metrics for accountability that prioritized impact over image. And she made one condition non-negotiable: that every flight crew member, from captain to cabin, undergo annual immersive workshops led by people who had once been overlooked, displaced, or stereotyped mid-flight, not just to teach empathy, but to ingrain it. A year to the day after that fateful flight, Raven and Ava boarded a new Skylux aircraft, different livery, different crew, same seat number, 2A. This time, Ava was welcomed into the cockpit with a captain who knelt to her eye level, asked if she liked science, and showed her the controls with the same wonder he'd given dozens of children before her. No hesitation, no exception. The same young attendant who offered Raven a towel also offered one to the woman behind her and the man beside her, without hierarchy, without weight. The air didn't carry judgment. The temperature didn't exclude. There were no whispered codes, no rotating service patterns, no invisible rules. There was only flight. At 36,000 feet, Raven looked out the window, not to escape, but to appreciate. She hadn't just won a seat. She had reset the cabin. She had reprogrammed the altitude at which respect could no longer be denied. And as the sun broke through the clouds ahead, golden and blinding, Ava leaned in close and asked, "Is this what justice looks like?" Raven smiled, eyes fixed on the horizon. "No," she said softly. "This is what change feels like." The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Raven's journey impacted you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and join the conversation.